The history of African slavery in the United States is most often associated with white European settlers and their vast plantations in the South. However, a lesser-known yet profoundly significant chapter of this history involves the practice of slavery by Native American tribes, specifically the Civilized Tribes. These tribes, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, Muskogee, and Seminole, not only adapted to European American ways of life, but also became participants in the institution of African slavery. Understanding how and why these tribes adopted slavery, and the complexities of that decision, reveals a story that blends survival, economic pressures, and social dynamics. The term civilized tribes refers to 5 southeastern Native American tribes that were perceived by European Americans as having adopted many European customs, such as centralized governments, Christianity, and plantation-style agriculture. These tribes, spread across different parts of the southeastern United States, were the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, Muskogee, and Seminole. The Cherokee were located in Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Alabama. The Choctaw lived primarily in Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana, while the Chickasaw resided in northern Mississippi, western Tennessee, and parts of Alabama. The Creek, Muskogee inhabited regions of Georgia and Alabama. The Seminole tribe, which formed in Florida, consisted of various groups, including runaway Creeks. These tribes were collectively labeled civilized tribes because they had adopted many aspects of European American culture. In response to the pressure of colonization, they adopted European agricultural methods, forming large-scale farms and, eventually, turning to African slavery to support their economic efforts. Slavery, particularly chattel slavery, was not traditionally a part of Native American culture in the same way it was for Europeans. But over time, the tribes adopted the practice as a survival strategy. Several factors contributed to the decision by the civilized tribes to engage in African slavery. As the southeastern United States became more economically dependent on the production of cash crops like cotton, tobacco, and rice, the tribes faced immense pressure to integrate into this economy. These crops were labor-intensive, and African slavery provided a way to meet the high labor demands while competing with white settlers. The civilized tribes sought to assimilate into the European American way of life in the hope of maintaining their lands and sovereignty. By adopting European customs, including slavery, they believed they could gain respect and protection from the United States government, which consistently pushed for their removal. Within the tribes, slaveholding became a symbol of power and wealth. Native elites, particularly in the Cherokee, Choctaw, and Chickasaw tribes, accumulated large numbers of slaves to work on plantations, growing crops that were critical to their economies. Slavery, like in the rest of the South, became a marker of economic success and societal status. The practice of slavery varied between tribes, but in all cases the tribes primarily acquired African slaves by purchasing them from European traders or through the capture of runaway slaves who had fled white plantations. These slaves were then put to work in agricultural production, domestic service, and skilled trades. In the Cherokee Nation, slavery was widespread, especially on large plantations in Georgia and Tennessee. The Cherokee elite adopted plantation-style farming, using African slaves to grow cotton, tobacco, and corn. By 1835, the Cherokee Nation held approximately 4,000 black slaves. Cherokee slaveholders mirrored the practices of white Southerners, employing strict racial hierarchies that kept African slaves at the bottom of society. Both the Choctaw and Chickasaw tribes were heavily involved in plantation agriculture in Mississippi and Alabama, relying on African slaves to work the cotton fields. Estimates suggest the Choctaw held around 2,000 to 2,500 slaves, while the Chickasaw owned between 1,000 and 2,000. These tribes viewed slave ownership as a means of economic survival and status, and they developed plantations that were indistinguishable from those run by white Southern planters. The Creek initially engaged in slavery on a smaller scale, but eventually expanded their reliance on enslaved labor, particularly as they became more involved in the cotton economy. African slaves in Creek society worked in agriculture and as domestic servants, performing labor critical to the tribe's prosperity. By the 1830s, the Creek owned an estimated 1,000 to 2,000 slaves. The Seminole had a more complicated relationship with slavery. In Florida, the Seminoles were known for harboring runaway slaves who escaped white plantations. While the Seminoles did own slaves, fewer than other tribes, possibly around 1,000, these Africans often lived in semi-autonomous communities and held more personal freedoms than slaves in other tribes. The African Seminoles fought alongside the tribe in conflicts and sometimes held important roles within the community. A particularly dark aspect of the slavery practiced by the civilized tribes was the sexual exploitation of enslaved women. Like their white counterparts, some Native American slaveholders exploited their power over enslaved African women for sexual purposes. The vulnerabilities of enslaved women, who were viewed as property, made them especially susceptible to coercion, assault, and other forms of abuse. In Cherokee and Choctaw societies where plantations and agricultural production were closely modeled after the Southern system of slavery, sexual exploitation was not uncommon. African women were subjected to unwanted advances and rape by their native masters, a practice that reflected the broader power dynamics of slavery. These relationships were often coerced, with women having little to no agency in such encounters. In many cases, the children born from these forced unions remained enslaved, continuing the cycle of bondage for future generations. Chickasaw slaveholders, particularly the elite families who owned large numbers of slaves, also engaged in this practice. As in white Southern society, enslaved women in Chickasaw households faced the dual oppression of racial and gender-based exploitation. In many instances, these women were expected to perform domestic duties during the day and were subjected to sexual violence at night. In contrast, the Seminole tribe's more inclusive approach to runaway African slaves resulted in fewer documented cases of sexual exploitation. Since the Seminoles often integrated runaway slaves into their communities as allies, and in some cases family members, African women were less likely to face the same kind of systemic abuse that occurred in the other civilized tribes. However, this did not mean sexual exploitation was entirely absent in Seminole society. One of the most harrowing chapters in the history of the civilized tribes was the forced relocation known as the Trail of Tears. In the 1830s, under the Indian Removal Act, President Andrew Jackson's administration forcibly removed the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole from their ancestral lands in the southeast to Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma. This relocation was brutal, and thousands of Native Americans died along the way from disease, exposure, and starvation. Enslaved African people owned by the civilized tribes were not spared from this ordeal. They were forced to march alongside their native owners, enduring the same hardships: extreme weather, lack of food, and disease. In some cases, the slaves were even required to perform labor during the march, carrying supplies and attending to the needs of the sick and elderly. This added an extra layer of suffering for those who were already enduring the crushing weight of slavery. In their new home in Indian Territory, the tribes rebuilt their societies, and, well, slavery continued to be a central part of their economies. The plantations that were once scattered across the southeast were re-established in Oklahoma, and the slaves were once again put to work growing crops, tending livestock, and serving in the homes of their native owners. The Civil War drastically altered the course of slavery in the United States, including among the civilized tribes. Like the southern states, the civilized tribes were divided in their loyalties. The Choctaw and Chickasaw largely sided with the Confederacy, hoping that a southern victory would preserve their slaveholding way of life. The Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole were more divided, with some factions supporting the Union and others the Confederacy. After the Confederacy's defeat, the U.S. government forced the tribes to sign new treaties in 1866. These treaties required the tribes to free their slaves and offer them full citizenship within the tribe. The Cherokee, for example, initially granted freedmen citizenship, though later disputes over tribal identity and the inclusion of African-descended people would emerge. The end of slavery marked a new beginning for African slaves, but it did not mean the end of struggle. Many newly freed slaves found themselves without resources, land, or economic opportunities, while some tribes, such as the Seminoles, integrated freed slaves into their communities more readily. Others were reluctant to fully incorporate freedmen as equals. This led to ongoing legal battles over land ownership, citizenship, and rights within the tribes, conflicts that persist even today, particularly among the Cherokee freedmen. Freed African slaves, or freedmen, faced an uncertain future in Indian Territory after emancipation. Some continued to work for their former native masters as sharecroppers or laborers. Others formed their own communities, seeking independence from the tribes that had once enslaved them. However, the promise of full citizenship was not always realized. In the Cherokee and Creek nations, for example, freedmen were initially granted citizenship, but over time some tribes rescinded these rights, sparking legal and social battles that would last well into the 21st century. In addition to legal struggles, the legacy of sexual exploitation left deep scars. The descendants of enslaved women who had been sexually exploited by their native masters were often left in limbo, marginalized both within Native American societies and by the larger African American community. These mixed-race individuals, often called Black Indians, faced a unique set of challenges in asserting their identity and claiming their place in either community. The history of slavery among the civilized tribes reveals a complex and often tragic narrative of survival, adaptation, and exploitation. These tribes, struggling to maintain their autonomy in the face of relentless pressure from white settlers, adopted African slavery as part of their effort to survive in a rapidly changing world. In doing so, they became entangled in the same systems of oppression that had long marginalized them. The story of African slaves in the civilized tribes, marked by forced labor, sexual exploitation, and resilience, remains a powerful testament to the complexity of American history. Today, the descendants of these slaves continue to seek recognition, justice, and reconciliation with the tribes that once enslaved them, ensuring that this chapter of history is not forgotten.